dollars in library contributions at work. Yep. I am Bill Crawford, and I am delighted and honored and humbled and touched to facilitate this discussion this afternoon. Glad to say more about it. You're in the right place if you come to 1968, civil rights, voting rights, and social justice, then and now. I want to take a moment to introduce this wonderful panel. Oh, Eddie, you're here. This is good. This is not homeroom, so if you're late, that's quite all right. But before introducing the panel, we have a word of welcome that I'm glad to call forward. Susan Riley, who is here at the Mamaroneck Library, and we're very, very grateful. Susan, you've worked this room before, so
I have, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Susan Riley. I'm the director of the Mamaroneck Library. Thank you so much for coming today. I know on such a beautiful day it's hard to pull yourself away and come into the building, but we're very, very glad that you're here. Just a quick couple of housekeeping things. I wanted to let you know that this is our final program in our 1968 series. We're capping it off with a nice size audience, so this is wonderful. So thank you to everyone, thank you to all the participants, and I'm glad that everybody has enjoyed this series, and in 2 years we'll probably be doing a fiction book next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mentioned those adjectives: honored, delighted, humbled, touched, to facilitate and attempt to do that on this very significant topic, along with thanks to the Mamaroneck Library, and I should say the Larchmont Library too, should I not, insofar as this topic, this book discussion over the course of this year, the 50th year since 1968, and hence the title of the book, 1968, by Mark Kurlansky, the year that rocked the world. Stay tuned for what that has meant there and what we will be saying across the course of this panel. But I want to say something about the Committee on and for Human Rights that has been chaired by Mary Lee Behrens, who is here with us. Mary Lee. As we on the committee were introduced to this book study over the course of the year, Mary Lee was really a champion for the cause and concern of wanting to make sure that this particular topic, in the realm of civil rights, voting rights, social justice, was not missed. And so with great thanks to all who have been hands-on in the formulation and gathering and the preparation planning for this event, great thanks. It's certainly not off the calendar. It's certainly touching and on our hearts, and the panelists here can help us to affirm and verify that. And so with no further ado, I'm glad to announce the panelists. Again, here's that word, humbled, and overjoyed and delighted. To my right, and I guess it's to most of your left, is a dear friend, Marge Lindblom, who has been a practicing attorney at the firm of Kirkland Ellis. She has been a co-chair of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. She herself, back in the day, we won't be revealing ages here, but nonetheless, she and I are compatriots chronologically, along with some other shared ways. She was a student back in college around that time. And then more recently, as we'll hear more about the voting rights, has been active in some more recent activity with regard to voting rights in the New York State Bar. Further down the line to Marge's right and your right is Jeffrey King. Jeffrey has grown up in this area, Yonkers, and then moving to Larchmont, and then a graduate along the way of Mamaroneck High School. He was all of middle school age. Again, we're not revealing years unless the panelists want to do that, but Jeffrey can attest to what was going on, and a special feature of that is the connection with his family, his mom and dad, whom some of you in this audience know, Barbara and Lloyd King. His dad, Lloyd, was quite active in matters of public discourse and service, was on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Westchester County, which got its manifestation and beginning soon after the Civil Rights Act and the initiation from LBJ. Jeffrey can tell us some very touching story and account insofar as Father Lloyd and activity with, yes, here in the county, but also nationally with one Robert F. Kennedy. And then moving right down the line, he made it. We're glad he did. He's a sophomore at the Mamaroneck High School. He's been active in the hashtag Never Again group at the high school, that not just at the high school, but nationwide, has been particularly active in anti-gun violence and movement going forward. Eddie Cam, who is here with us, and much more can be said, but I'm going to punctuate and move to my left. And let me start. There we go. There we go. To the left. Bill Coffin, William Sloan Coffin, wrote a book. Bill being one of my mentors, I couldn't resist this. This is a theologian and pastor who some of you know and have known of. Bill's book that came from a sermon entitled "The Heart is a Little to the Left." Hold that thought. But before
nothing political,
never about Bill Coffin. But I couldn't resist then turning to you, Alex, and we'll save Sophia for just a moment. But Mr. Alex Forger is here in our midst. He has been a resident here in Larchmont and now resides in the city back in that time and day of 1968. And on into more recent moments has been an attorney at the Millbank Tweed in the city. Along the way, after serving in World War II as a Marine Corps sergeant, and there was artillery involved in all that, he can duly note that, but going forward, after Princeton undergrad and Yale Law School, went on to law practice that included public matters, which entailed, among others, pro bono, or as however the firm allowed this to happen or supported him in happening, involvement with the Legal Aid Society locally and nationally in Washington, D.C. And along the way, in the course of some of this chronology, which he can speak to, if you'll recall, matters of fair housing, civil rights legislation, the Fair Housing Act, which maybe you saw recently, the Walter Mondale comment. I was looking for a letter to the editor from Alex Forger on this, but Mondale wrote a piece in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. That was back in the day and time when, in the aftermath of that, Mr. Alex Forger was the court-appointed master for the integration of to oversee the integration of Yonkers public schools and public housing. So there is more than just particular knowledge and hands-on understanding and expertise, but some heartfelt connection. I could go on and on Alex, but I'll stop. You're still on the left, and I'll just make note of that. Okay, very good. And then we're poignantly flanked on both sides, right and left, across this spectrum here and across this panel by some young people who we are greatly appreciative for, Eddie, and to you, Sophia. Sophia is a graduating, Sophia Pasila is a graduating senior, soon to graduate. She may have senioritis, but she's here today, and we are so very grateful for her presence. She has been noted and touted by the League of Women Voters for special distinction, and you can tell us what that has been.
It was for students inside Albany, a conference.
Uh-huh.
So they send me to Albany for 5 days. I meet with congressmen and women.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I'm really excited. It's in May. So
Okay, it's in May.
Yeah.
It's in May. So come June, we should have a panel with you, and you can tell us what happened. Indeed, she's on her way to Barnard College in the fall, and we are glad to be in touch with her now. There's at least one Barnard alum in the audience. And I am, with no further ado, after this introduction, I should say a word about myself. I happen to be the senior pastor of the Larchmont Avenue Church, which is a position in place and people that I dearly, dearly love. I've been there for the past 19 years. I say that with a pause and a full heart because I'll be heading to the Episcopal Seminary in New York City, General Theological, come the end of the summer, where my wife, Julie Parker, who some of you know, will be a professor of biblical studies. And there's a project there known as the Desmond Tutu Center for Peace and Justice that I am glad to be involved in. But up ahead, that is. And in the meantime, I'm delighted to be here, and delighted to be here with you now. You'll see this title. This could take us 50 years to cover, much less the 90 minutes that we're allotting here today. And so what I'd like to do is turn to the three or four older ones on this panel. And I think by now you know who they are. And to ask for some perspective and note on the then, and then we'll be moving to now. I mentioned friend Alex Forger and history going back in talking with him and preparing for this discussion, as Alex comes with significant civil rights, social justice, mind you, the Fair Housing Act, and some real particulars in there.
And significant age.
And, yeah. And as facilitator, I made it clear, have I not, with lawyers present on either side of me, that I will not say anything about age or chronology with specificity. If they want to, they can, okay? But quite frankly, with regard to Alex, the realm and the particulars of civil rights and some legislation that ensued from that in the realm of, again, then. Okay, likewise, following Alex will be Marge on matters of voting rights then, before we get to now, and some other things along the way. And then Brother Jeffrey, as we talk about the scene right here in our community, particularly Larchmont, Mamaroneck. And then we're going to get into the now, and so Sophia and Eddie, stay tuned, and you can kind of help us to bring it into the future going forward. So Alex, let me turn to you with regard to that, the realm that we've cited for you.
Well, I'm preaching to the choir here, I think, as I see the folks out here. Many of them I know from a long time back, active in the community and beyond, and in the legal world. I've been accused of being a one-trick pony, which seems to be legal justice. But it ain't a bad category to be involved with, I think. But, you know, as I talk to the young frequently, my concern frequently is that if you're not older than 20, you know very little about the world that preceded you. I don't need to go back to the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, though we'll mention, you know, the preamble to the Constitution talks about, in order to form a more perfect union, we first thing establish justice, and that is key. You know, if we have justice, then we have a civil society, and if we don't have a tranquil society, then we don't need the common defense. And you've heard some of these no peace, no justice. I think that stems from the preamble said justice was the preeminent one, followed by a tranquil domestic society. So we have not always had a equal justice. In fact, we haven't yet attained it. But we keep working at it, notwithstanding changes of personnel, attitudes, and positions. From the lawyer's point of view, at least from my perspective, you know, if I look at Brown versus Board of Education back in 1954, which for the first time, the beginning of school desegregation, The court said separate but equal has no place, but there was a resistance to it nonetheless. It was overturning Plessy v. Ferguson, under which doctrine separate but equal was okay. So that was a major premise that led to much activity in the beginning of trying to integrate schools. Then we came Baker v. Carr in '62. One person, one vote. You can't draw voting lines that violate equal protection laws. But I know we will hear more about the voting rights and the consequences of that simple statement. Then an important one of Gideon v. Wainwright, where for the first time defendants in criminal cases have the absolute right to counsel. Later extended to cases where the penalty was 6 months or more. Following that, I guess we got the Second Amendment, the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. The right to vote shall not be denied by reason of failure to pay a poll tax or any other tax. Moving on, we got to Griswold, protection of individual privacy and use of contraceptives in Connecticut. There was a Connecticut law prohibiting the sale of contraceptives. We got to Miranda in 1966, your right to remain silent. Then we had voting rights laws, and we had fair housing laws in '68. And one of my favorite parts of this whole exercise was Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty in '65, '66, which for the first time had the federal government recognizing that there was an obligation on the part of the society in whole, and the federal government in particular, to try to create circumstances under which those in poverty can achieve a more complete life, can move from poverty, whether it would be education or schooling, residentials, opportunities to join the far greater society to which they had really been denied. From my point of view, one of the principal purposes of the OEO was the creation, for the first time ever, of a legal services arm being funded by the federal government. Legal services have been around for years on a contributory basis. It was charity. No matter that your opponent had a lawyer, it's too bad if you didn't have one, whether it would be housing eviction or domestic violence or consumer fraud. That was too bad. But they established an arm to provide lawyers, to provide not only legal justice, but social and economic justice. It evolved into the Legal Services Corporation, which provides lawyers throughout the country, helping those who can't afford counsel in all areas of their concerns and their rights. So the 60s, from one point of view, had some very important moments and some long-standing contributions to the society. But alas, throughout it all was the war on poverty. And as the Kerner Commission stated in its review of the civil rights and the riots, we were a country divided in two, one white and one black. And that's where we got certainly into 1968, where there was a combination of concern for civil liberties, as well as the opportunity to have housing, to have an existence that had been denied them, as well as the war itself in Vietnam. So we're up to 68, and I took you a little bit beyond.
Yeah, yeah. Now, if I may, I feel like we might be singing a duet, sharing the microphone here close up, but you have done that, and indeed a little bit beyond. I think perhaps, you know, as we go beyond, I could turn to Marge now with some particulars in terms of what the stage set has been and meant. One of the things that's, as you listen to Alex just now, the element of the Legal Services Corporation on the heels of, or the manifestation of some of the initiative that we saw and witnessed with LBJ, mind you, who stepped in some rather significant ways upon the death, the assassination of JFK, and here was so much done, said, you know, accomplished in that initial run-up. And you mentioned one of those things, the Legal Services Corporation, which I cannot resist saying, simply because you were in a key role with said agency in a directorship capacity in Washington, D.C. And what were those years, Alex, as we make... I'm sorry.
Oh, let me see, let me count the way.
Okay.
It was 1960, no, my wife is saying no. No. Yeah, it was 1993, yes, a little bit later, 93 to 97, during the course of which the new Congress came in, known as the Christian Coalition, or the Moral Majority, whose principal purpose was to destroy and end this corporation.
Hold that thought. And as we proceed, and you can see the wonder and the challenge of this particular panel, because yes, we've noted 1 year, 1968. Alex does well to help us to note the preface to that, the run-up to that in some rather distinct ways. And given that I have the microphone and the chair here, I couldn't resist noting the personal connection that you had with that, not wanting to miss that. So thank you. I turn now to Marge Lindblom, and one connection, lest it be lost on you, because I think it's rare and wonderful. On either side of me sit two attorneys who have both served in the leadership of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. Alex was one of the very helpful and pioneer founders of that. Again, we won't name the year, but he can. And then in some time after that, Marge Lindblom was a co-president? Co-chair. Co-chair of that. And across those years, yes, that entity, yes, those attorneys, two of them present here with us, have done and said and meant an awful lot in the course of the topic here today, civil rights, voting rights, social justice. That's a bit of a segue transition to Sister Marge as she takes at it.
Okay, well, first going back to 1968, Bill said he wanted to get some sense of, you know, where we were and what our involvement was. And basically, I was an average college student back then. Everybody was concerned, at least in my world, everybody was concerned about the Vietnam War. Certainly civil rights was an important issue still, although I think that at least among white college students, there was some sense that things were getting better. And women's rights was barely peeking over the horizon, and many of you lived through, and others of you have read about the events of '68, and you know the various traumas, including, and good things, including Johnson, who had accomplished wonderful things in civil rights, deciding not to continue as president, the assassinations of King and Bobby Kennedy, the 1968 Chicago Convention, where I was present, and my husband, who I didn't then know, who had just finished Marine boot camp, I think I've got those years right for the Marine part, and so it was looking very clean cut, was beat up during the police riot, and then of course we had the election where Nixon won at the end, and so it was a very important year, certainly in our country. My involvement in voting rights, other than being a typical concerned college student, came much later, but I have since learned the history, and I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the history. The big time for voting rights is 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Prior to that, you had both subtle and blatant violations of rights to vote. There were literacy tests, there were so-called grandfather exemptions to literacy tests, so that if your grandfather or some male ancestor had been allowed to vote back before Reconstruction, you were allowed to vote whether you could read or not, but not if you didn't have that. And of course, only whites were allowed to vote up until the Reconstruction era, so that effectively eliminated a lot of the population. You had poll taxes, you had discretionary registration of voters. And what this led to was, for example, in Mississippi, there was a voting age population of 450,000 African Americans. 26,000 of them had been allowed to register to vote. In this county that includes Selma, Alabama, there were 15,000 blacks of voting age. 335 had been allowed to register. People were literally killed, shot at, beaten, all kinds of things. And many of you will remember this, for trying to help blacks register to vote. And just to compare, the Selma, that was 2.2% of the blacks were allowed to register, whereas 66% of the whites were registered. So it was just blatantly discriminatory. And even after the Civil Rights Act was passed, Martin Luther King wrote about how important it was that voting, which he termed the foundation stone for political action, that the right to vote be guaranteed to all eligible citizens. And he called for, and a bipartisan majority passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that Voting Rights Act guaranteed minorities access to voting under a permanent section, and then it also set up some temporary sections. And I'll come back to this later if you maybe in talking about what's going on with voting rights now, but it basically permitted federal observers to go down and make sure that registration processes were conducted fairly, make sure that elections were conducted fairly in areas where voting had been blatantly suppressed. And very importantly, it required pre-clearance for changes in voting in these areas where voting had previously been suppressed. And pre-clearance means that you couldn't suddenly change the voting place, and certain areas, of course, and not happen to tell people what it was. They actually had to go to the Department of Justice and say, or they could go to court also, but usually they went to the Department of Justice and say, we want to change this polling place because the fire station's been moved or whatever, and give reasons. And the Department of Justice could turn it down, and then they could appeal if they needed to. But typically, once the Department of Justice had ruled, that was enough. And so this pre-clearance procedure had a major impact on keeping voting rights, and making sure that people could vote. By the time, let's see, I wrote this down somewhere. In Mississippi, my recollection is that having gone from a small percentage, I think it was 7% of the people overall who were allowed to register, within a year after the voting rights passing, they had more than 60% of African American voting age population was registered to vote. So it made a huge difference to have these federal laws passed. And here's my thing. Yeah, nationwide, by 1968, 58.5% of blacks were registered. And we went from, I looked up some census statistics. In the South in 1964, 44% of blacks and other races, as they called it, actually voted. Now that included a wider swath of states. And by 1968, so just a few years later, that was 50% larger. It was 51.6% of blacks were voting. So these laws made a real difference. It didn't solve the problems, but at least it was a tangible sign of progress that the Voting Rights Act was passed. And when we get to now, then I'll tell you the bad news about what's happened since then.
Okay, it's a setup, everybody. Okay, stay tuned for more. We have with Alex and Marge noted, elements, features back then with a notable preface, and thank you very much for that, Alex. And then Sophia and Eddie, stay tuned as we, make this turn with some reflections and call for now. But in the meantime, Jeffrey King sits in a wonderful situation, having, as you listen to elements of here's civil rights, here's national scope and the like, even listen closely as you hear Alex note that war on poverty and the elements initiated in the administration of LBJ, because there's a family connection for and with the King family in terms of stuff on the ground, if you will, locally, Westchester County and the like, but also some personal situation, perspective, reflection. So Jeff, we're really quite glad to turn to you. And I look across the table here, and you're the one who's come best and most well equipped with some show and tell objects too that are more than just artifacts. But let me turn to you.
Well, I thank you, Bill, and it's an honor, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Just one correction, we were in Mount Vernon and not Yonkers. That's one small minor. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to see and to meet once again familiar people who knew my parents growing up in Larchmont and Mamaroneck. And let me just say that I'm not afraid to put out my age. So my perspective of the civil rights is of, I won't say an infant, but I was born in '58. So it was during the start of the civil rights. At that time, we lived in Mount Vernon. At that time, we lived on the south side of Mount Vernon. And I remember distinctly as a young boy of not knowing of my dad's role, but of his participation, of the frequency of the meetings, of hearing as a young child about the Supreme Court, about civil rights, about Martin Luther King. And it just manifested itself through the years as I became older. But as a young child in '64, it wasn't the voting rights, but it was more of desegregation. It was integration. And there was actually the busing case, Jeffrey L. King versus the Mount Vernon Board of Education. And that was in 1964. And I remember as a child getting on the bus and going up to Albany, to the Capitol, since I was a plaintiff, for the case. I think we got ice cream on the way. But I have before me these aids here, because Alex, you were touching on the war on poverty, and that was very much a conversation. The war on poverty, the civil rights, the housing, and later years, the Vietnam War. That's what we're discussing. And that was, my brother and I, that was dinner topic, that was conversation. That was dinner banter, going back and forth between my parents or whoever else might be in the house at the time. My folks participated in the March on Washington. There were many conversations on the war on poverty. And this is what was just a daily occurrence in our household growing up. Unfortunately, we lost the case for integration. And that is really the premise of why we moved to Larchmont, because education was always a key. Education was not a key, but education was considered to be a right proper education, equal education, fair education. And we talk about Cleese versus Ferguson. This is what I grew up with. Not my idols, because one of my idols was the Jets, but Thurgood Marshall and the Supreme Court justices. This is what I grew up with. The Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, and then Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This is what was dear to my heart. This is what I was raised to understand, that yes, there are inequalities in the country, but right-minded people, the people that sit here before me this afternoon, we're here to make a change in Mount Vernon and a change in Mamaroneck. And just going forward, my years as a young adult, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but growing up in Larchmont and coming across as a young adult now, racial injustices here in town, and how that has evolved over the years, and how now my family, now that I'm raising a family, how I perceive them growing up and their experiences and what they're going through. Oh, I'm sorry. Introduction. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get to Eddie, you and Sophia in terms of some, a further phase, but in the meantime now, I wonder, Jeff, you kind of tip your hand to that in terms of, if I may, particulars, here in the community encountered, as we talk about that age, that era. Now, obviously, as you revealed it, so 58 puts you at 10 years old in 1968. If I may, and while you're thinking about that question, and there's some people in the room now who can attest to this particular history. Yes, the year 1968 was profound and full in terms of events, activities. We began the year with, January's count of war dead in Vietnam at 185. We ended the year with 14,000 deaths. I mean, before we got out of January, we had the Tet Offensive, which, all told, exceeds with both sides of the death count, something exceeding 60,000. We made our way, did we? We certainly saw the calendar pages turn to the point where LBJ, on the night of March 31st, announced that he would not, seek re-election. In the time following that, here came some initiative with more wind in the sails, thanks to that statement from LBJ, from Eugene McCarthy. Marge, you could talk about that in certain ways. But then here was Bobby Kennedy, and yes, Bobby surged, but only to be met with his assassination a little later. But then, soon after LBJ, it was April 4th, at which point, after the speech the night before at the temple in Memphis, Martin Luther King was slain. I bring it to that date in some particular simply because here in the community, it was the day after that there was to be something of a protest afoot in the community. And before I disclose the nature of that, does anybody know what that issue or protest was or could have been? It resonates with something we're contending with now. Mary Lee?
The zoning situation in the elementary schools.
Exactly. I mean, words like redistricting, might have been uttered. There was capacity concern that was certainly uttered. Sound familiar? Ringing some bells? I mean, certainly it was the case that at the Murray Avenue School there was a bulging such that, oh my gosh, where to put these, students that we didn't anticipate as the year began. And one of the proposals was that we just take the older grades, the 6th grade, and put them at the Mamaroneck Avenue School. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. And this was in the day and time. I was growing up in Northeast Philadelphia. There were petitions around anti-busing in white neighborhoods that my mother refused, who was a public health nurse, refused to sign. But we had that in some percolating ways around these parts. And it was not long after that, that kind of King's assassination stilled that, issue and all that fervor or whatever else we want to call it. Because, oh my gosh, what did that initiative, gulp from Murray Avenue school parents, mean, and how did that sound in the midst of, the stuff that was still ringing out, even though he was killed, from Dr. King, about the beloved community. So moving forward, it was on the 10th of April. Eddie and Sophia, get ready for this. And by the way, are you writing this down? You might get credit for this. It's to say that on the 10th of April, okay, which was the day after the funeral service for Dr. King, there was, how about this, a walkout. All of the students at the Mamaroneck High School walked out. It was an element at a time, and those of us who might have been in college can attest to this, where teach-ins and people just stopped, or many did stop, to say, well, who are we? What is this about? What can we do in terms of across racial lines, and even to hear that phrase again, the beloved community. So I want to inject this, Jeff, to kind of warm you up if you might want to make any particular response about the growing up days. And what you experienced or witnessed. Because around about that time, if we're looking at 1968, it would have been after the invocation of civil rights legislation, LBJ's empowering activity. Here came matters like Legal Services Corporation, like the War on Poverty, which here's a little editorial, and I hope we can pick up on this one later. Back then, we had the War on Poverty. It seems like in current times with current administration, we have a war on the poor instead of a war on poverty. Let's get to that as we get to the now. But in the meantime, might you care to say anything further about
Certainly.
life in the day?
At home with the Kings?
Well, I think with a lot of families and a lot of communities, the assassination of King, it was a very traumatic experience. But it started, though, with the assassination of Kennedy. I think a lot of us in this room remember sitting at the television and watching the funeral procession. And there was just a deep sense of loss, of not knowing where the country was headed. Followed by the assassination, because you always, well, as a young child, yes, I didn't know what assassination was until Kennedy was killed. But after that, and starting to hear or listen to my parents speak of the possibility of, or the death threats to King, and when King was assassinated, there was just a personal, even at a young age, just a personal loss, and a loss of not knowing who was going to be the leader, if there was someone that could step up. And obviously that would never occurred, but to step up and take his place and take the mantle and lead the civil rights issues. And then, followed by, and only 3 months, but there was still a fever of hope, particularly in our household, because there was conversations of moving down to DC, because there were conversations of, well, Bobby is going to take up the mantle and Bobby is going to run for president. And even as a young child, I remember discussions around the dinner table, well, how would you like to move down to DC? Because that's where we are going. There's been discussions, your father is going to, be in the, I don't know, be in the administration, but we were going to move down to DC. And when Bobby was killed, it just took all of, as a young child, it took all of the hope that I had for this country, for civil rights. I was deflated. It was just a very depressing time. a time I think when perhaps a lot of people of my age, not being in college, being a young adult, not knowing of where the country was headed, and who was going to, how could this possibly happen? And yes, we all heard horror stories of Hoover, and you heard conspiracy theories. But to allow 3 assassinations in this westernized country which we live in just seemed to be unconscionable, and it still is as an adult. So there was a great sense of not knowing, there was a great sense of loss, and just of really floating. Well, we've come so far, and yes, we have so far to go, but how can we possibly get there? And that was really the feeling that was in our household, and as a young adult going through in '68, and then '69 was, well, '69 became more of the topic of the Vietnam War, and the injustices of the Vietnam War, and then finding out, well, the French had fought this war 12 years earlier, and had lost in '54. So why are we back in Vietnam, in the '60s? I still remember, my mother loading us in the back of the VW Bug, driving into Manhattan to take us out of school to see the movie Alice's Restaurant. And not knowing what we were in store for, because my dad always just take us to see the James Bond films, so it's, Mom had a different mindset. But that's where we were. It was important for her to take us out of school and go into the city to take, her 11-year-old and 8-year-old son to sit down and watch Alice's Restaurant, and come home at Thanksgiving, and what was playing at Thanksgiving. And I terrorize my family now. I shouldn't say terrorize, but I sing Alice's Restaurant. I used to know that song. So that was my feelings back in '68 and '69. It was a great sense of loss, and of not knowing of where the country was headed.
I'm just curious, Eddie, Sophia, Alice's Restaurant, the film? Yeah. Okay, stay here on the panel, because we're gonna check in with you. And by the way, you can recite your playlist for us and see if any of us can identify with that. I think that might be. But I mean, one of the things, along with the refrain, you can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant, there's something of a culture, duly noted, that may entail some contraband that we won't get into right now with regard to that. But there was a draft board dynamic in that movie that was really quite something. And so, oh my gosh, here's a mother taking her children, for all the above, to that movie, and taking them out of school, for that matter, too. Oh my gosh, hold that thought. Let me try this, because as we make our way, with all due respect for the time and the fullness, before us, we've said, have we not, at least I did, that I hope we could, having, noted these elements of perspective and points back then, what have been some steps, and response back then going forward, before we get to the now? And Alex, to turn back to you, by that I mean, you mentioned the Legal Services Corporation. You took us up to with the preface to 1968. Here came the actions of the War on Poverty and LPJ, even before we get, January was a different mood in the White House, wasn't it? But then here came Ted, here came, some real intense matters, but still, he was on course. There were some plans and initiatives that even beyond 1968, as you mentioned, the Legal Services Corporation were manifest in place and continuing. I wonder if you could speak to that, namely, what was set in motion, in this particular year, that called out matters of, justice, rights, and even an administration that, dare I say, cared about that.
Well, I'm just picking up with the war on poverty. and the founding of the Legal Services Corporation, which was President Nixon's last act in 1974. It took several years to transfer or translate from the War on Poverty's Sergeant Shriver running a legal service arm to getting this federally funded program approved by Congress, because it was to do the funding. Nixon had vetoed one bill because he felt he didn't have enough control over who would run the corporation. But it finally was enacted in '74 with the notion that a lawyer for a poor person could do everything that he could do or she could do for a paying client. And so there were issues you could lobby, you could have class actions, you could do legislative advocacy, seeking to enhance the status of those in poverty to achieve a better life. And then we get into the political world. Following Nixon's departure, we had Mr. Ford for a little bit, who didn't care for the program. Then it came Jimmy Carter. And the program, by 1981, Jimmy Carter's last time, the funding had reached $320 million, which was a healthy sum, and that we had some 3,000 lawyers throughout the country providing access to justice for poor people. Then came our governor from California, Mr. Reagan, who, when governor of California, was being sued by some of the legal service lawyers for failure to enforce laws assuring safety, health, and housing for migrant workers in California. So he had an early dislike, and when he came into office, the first thing he wanted to do was to eliminate legal services. He said it should be the state matter, it's not a matter for the federal government. He managed to slash it by 25%, the funding, but he couldn't kill it all because Congress kept it alive. And from that, we ultimately worked our way through another administration into the administration of Jimmy, not Jimmy, but for the yeah, the Clinton, I'm sorry about it. How could I forget Bill Clinton? We thought the glory days had arrived for legal services, and we would be able to expand and continue doing all sorts of good things for those in poverty. We did the first year, that was my first year, and then came the 104th Congress, the Christian Coalition, so-called, the moral majority, so-called, determined through Mr. Gingrich, their leader, to destroy Legal Services Corporation. Again, I know lawyers aren't popular generally, but lawyers for poor people were in a difficult circumstance. I attended hearings for a year or two and was lectured and given anecdotes about why legal aid lawyers had killed children or put money into gay parades. You know, everything drove people out of the pickle business. It was all kind of anecdotal stuff. What they ended up doing was eliminated a major function of the Legal Services Corporation, which was social justice, lobbying, legislative advocacy, class actions eliminated, couldn't represent prisoners, you couldn't represent aliens. I mean, it went on. You couldn't take public money, private money, unless you put the same restrictions. So it was a sad ending. My experience there firsthand, which carries over to today, was that if you do not influence my re-election, and I'm very important as a member of Congress, then I'm not interested in what you have to say or who you represent. That became very evident. It was not only party over policy, but it was just discrimination, dislike, hatred, and that was the Republican Party platform. Kill off this program. We don't like what they're doing, and it's bringing to poor people in housing issues. They represent drug addicts and they get into crime, or in family matters, you give them benefits and they then lead to divorce, and then that leads to more crime and so on. The corporation lives today, but it has less funding than it had 30 years ago in real terms. So that's my legal services thing.
I just want to attempt and offer a punctuation, because you've given us much to consider, even, I mean, as you, in your opening comments, and now this follow-up comment with regard to Legal Service Corporation and this commitment that we saw nascent in 1968, emerging, going forward, next LBJ, with regard to a war on poverty and some programs and stuff and steps in process. I'm going to try a fancy footwork transition to Marge here and see what you think about this, especially Marge. And that is, back in those days, some of us, I guess that would be the two of us, and Jeff, you're a little younger, and Eddie and Sophia stand by because there's some inspiration in the era for you. But back then, it was people like, Alex, and some of those steps that we heard about, and took note of, that were inspirational to us insofar as public service, in terms of the public good, an effort in the public domain, concern for justice, even peace and justice. Give peace a chance. Hey, there's a phrase. But in terms of those efforts, vocationally, there were some steps and strides in spirit. We've moved in to some certain time, and even an era now where the incentive and spirit, for that is not as extensive or pervasive. Or Eddie and Sophia, I know I keep saying this, but you guys are on standby on this. But kind of what's in the air, sparking such a concern for public service, for commitment to matters of peace and justice, even vocationally. You happen to be, and here comes the segue. You happen to be a college student about that time. Here was a step, and when I say the program, Operation Crossroads. Crossroads Africa. That was a stunning and sterling program. How many people know that or heard of that? This is rather notable. There you go. There's dear Lance, spouse of Marge. But even it's included folks on both sides of the oceans. You'll note, won't you, that Barack Obama's dad was part of that, having come from Africa to study at the University of Hawaii. And the rest is history, where Barack was born.
Where was it going?
In Hawaii. In Hawaii. You got that? Okay. And that is a notable time and point of history as to when that birther movement got started and somebody's campaign and press got started. We'll just move on. Marge, you heard the question. Okay, you did. Okay. But in terms of the initiative, okay, that was sparked, in terms of interest and concern for, public service, for issues of justice and peace, and how you got sparked, and then going forward, I wanted to get to voting rights in your initiative.
Should I keep going all the way on voting rights?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, those of you of similar age know it was in the air, as you say. It was people like Alex who were inspiring the rest of us. Although I have to admit that when I first started college, I didn't know that girls could be lawyers, because that wasn't so much the case back then. I keep being reminded, and of Margaret Mead quote, but I know I'm going to butcher it, which is something along the lines of, and it's just slipped my mind, about how it takes a small group of committed and thoughtful people to do something to change the world. Indeed, that is the only way that change has ever occurred. And I think that those of us in college felt that at the time. And first of all, apologies to Lance for not mentioning his name earlier, having told you about how he got beat up. But I think, many of us in college were part of the demonstrations, the anti-war demonstrations, and we saw that you could have an effect by going out in the streets peacefully, because Johnson stepped down, and that was what we wanted. For all the good he had done on civil rights and voting rights and social justice, he was doing terrible things in Vietnam. It's a very mixed legacy, and it's not by any means all bad what he had done, but we were very happy to see that we had that impact. Of course, we thought we had done it, and partly we did. And remember that I, at least, was not yet 21, and so I couldn't vote. Young men were being sent off to fight and die who couldn't even vote. And so that was, that got changed, got not long after the 68 election. But let me, since I've got the mic, I'm going to catch you up on what happened with voting rights. So I think a lot of us thought, well, a lot of these issues were solved, things got better, and then we are faced with what our Supreme Court does now. And I told you about the Voting Rights Act and what it did. Well, there were these temporary procedures for pre-clearance and for observers that were reenacted. They were set in the initial act, they were set for a period of 5 years. 5 years later, they were reenacted. Again, it was for a period of 5 years, I think. And so they did that. They reenacted it in 70, again in 75, and in 75 they made it for 7 years. And then in 1982, when they reenacted it, they said, we're going to make it 25 years. Because they decided that it was a little too chancy to keep going every few years as to whether or not our voting rights should keep up. And so 1982 takes you to 2007. So in the 2005-2006 era, that's when this Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and many other groups got to work, or even before then, making sure that a factual record was put together so that even if the Republicans in Congress did not want to hold hearings about the Civil Rights Act, there would be a factual basis developed in other ways that Congress people could point to as saying this is a record for showing that the Voting Rights Act is still needed. With the various amendments and changes in this formula, which had to do with what percentage of people voted in particular areas and whether specific tests had been imposed for registration. There were 6 states that were covered in their entirety for the whole time from 1965 on. Another 3 states had been added, plus there were a bunch of other political subdivisions. So basically, most of the Southeast, other than Florida, was subject to these pre-clearance and observer provisions. Other states were added, Texas, Arizona, and Arkansas were added, and there were bunches of other political subdivisions in places like North Carolina, Florida, and New York, by the way, because it included language discrimination issues. And come the 2000s, certain voting districts that were subject to these provisions started claiming they should not be subject to them and that they were unconstitutional. And sure enough, in June of 2013, by a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court said the reenactment of these temporary provisions was unconstitutional because the formula hadn't been updated. And as there's a great Ginsburg quote, she wrote the dissent, and she said, in the court's view, the very success of these provisions of the Voting Rights Act demands its dormancy. Congress was of another mind. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. So all of a sudden, these people that used to have to get permission to make changes in voting didn't have to. And what happened? Well, the very next day, a Republican leader in North Carolina called a special session of the legislature. First, they wanted to go out and get information by race on how various voting practices were used. Early voting, different kinds of registration, voter ID provisions, all those kinds of things, absentee ballots. And so they picked and chose which of the provisions most affected minorities. And they decided to enact a law to prevent those, to restrict those ways of accessing voting. So, for example, they cut early voting from 17 to 10 days. They eliminated same-day registration. There had been some teenage voter pre-registration provisions. They got rid of those. If somebody accidentally cast a vote in the wrong precinct, they said they would no longer count those votes. They would no longer switch them over to count them in the correct precinct. And they did that all the next day. They started that procedure the next day. Now, the good news is that suit was brought on that particular provision, and I'm going to sneak a plug in here. I'm very proud to say that my law firm was involved in that on a pro bono basis. Those provisions were eventually struck down by the Court of Appeals, which said that, and it was a long time, it was a many-year process, and the district court did terrible things, but they eventually said that the legislature had gone with almost surgical precision to try to eliminate minority voting rights. And the reason, of course, that they wanted to do that is, it's partly they didn't want minorities to vote, period, but also because they figured they were going to vote Democratic. And so they did that. Texas, similarly, had enacted voter ID laws that had been subject to preclearance. Wisconsin did, and what studies have found since then is that approximately 17,000 votes, they estimate, 17,000 voters did not vote in the last presidential election in Wisconsin because the people thought they did not have proper ID under the new laws. The Texas ID law, which I have to say on a revised version was upheld just yesterday by the Court of Appeals, allowed you to use a gun permit as a valid ID to vote, but not a student ID, even if it was government issued. So these kinds of things have been happening, and at the same time we've got redistricting laws. I could go on and on about the redistricting. Let me try to summarize it really quickly. The Supreme Court has taken two cases, both of them have been argued just this year. One of them in Wisconsin said that the Republicans had redistricted and it was terribly unfair to the Democrats, and the defense was, this isn't about eliminating minority voting rights, it's about eliminating Democrats from voting, and so that's okay, because that's partisan, that's not discrimination. And the second one is in Maryland, where it is a Republican who was complaining, the Republican voters who were complaining about redistricting that was clearly done with the intention of eliminating a Republican congressional seat. So the thinking now is that they took one on the Democrat side and one on the Republican side, and maybe they will actually do something about redistricting. Hold on, you'll find out about the second week in June what the Supreme Court has or has not done, and it probably all turns on one single justice. So it all comes down to, who's on the Supreme Court when you want to decide what's going on with laws. I think I've talked about voting enough. I'll hand it back to you.
I think, thank you, Marge. This is turning into something of more than a seminar. It could be a full course in so many ways. You've said a number of very significant things, and I tried to use Alex's word, a preface to some points that could take us to Eddie and Sophia. So here it goes. You mentioned voting and age. In Texas, did I hear that right? A gun permit's acceptable, but not a student ID.
That's correct.
Oh my gosh, and how many states is that existent?
I think Texas is alone in that so far.
Okay. For those who might say don't mess with Texas, Texas needs to be messed with in terms of confronting that, if I could try for that phrase to turn it. But back to voting and back to students. Sophia, congratulations. Did you vote in this most recent election?
I did.
There we go. So there we go. And Eddie, here comes that age question. Were you able to vote in the most recent?
I was not, but that's because I'm not old.
Well, that's what I thought, that's what I thought. But we're looking forward to that, and there's a lot of help in this room as to registration and how to register to vote. Who can help Eddie register to vote? Okay, there's at least more than a few members of the League of Women Voters, where I actually had the pleasure of meeting Sophia, as we sat at table, and some of you were there too. I'm glad to turn to you too. Yes, we have one of you who's voted recently, and yes, as we heard in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting, the students who gathered, and not just that, but who stepped up, who initiated, who really led a movement in a rather distinct way, noted to the cameras, to unabashedly to say that we're voting, or we will be voting soon, and that was duly noted. I also know, and I don't know if you guys were there, but some students nearby and from New York State met with Senator Schumer. And Senator Schumer is the kind of an age cohort of some of the people up here. And he was quick to say that, well, back in the day, when I was your age, we were protesting in the streets. It had to do with matters of social justice and civil rights and the anti-war effort. And we got the attention of the president. Back then, it was President LBJ. And so he said to those students gathered, maybe you heard this, I took note of it too, more power to you, your voice is being heard. We hope that, like back in my day, said Senator Schumer, you get the attention of the president and you turn and change his mind. I hear some chuckles in the crowd. We're very hopeful about this. That's a little bit of a way to kind of turn to you insofar as your words on what it has meant to step up, to be involved. I know as I've talked with some of you, well, both of you directly, and Eddie, you wrote this in the most recent email, and you haven't been involved in things like this or politically or anything. You kind of love high school. You're active in PACE. I mean, it's a good experience, MHS, am I right? Yeah, but here comes something that's new into which you've stepped up. Some of us got to hear Eddie as well as Sophia in some of these recent gatherings, including the March the 14th, can we say walkout? But certainly there was the rally at Harbor Island. Some of us were there with you and listening to you, and we're glad to hear from you now. So let me, because I'm between both of you, who would like to go first? Yeah, let's go and then Sophia, you can.
Okay, well, I'll talk personally about my experience because, both my parents are a little bit to the left, and but my grandparents are more to the right, and a lot more to the right, and so as a kid, and growing up, I've always just wanted to hear the debate. I always wanted to hear what they had to say, and so when it came to when I was in 6th grade and I was coming home and my mom said, "Did you hear what happened in Connecticut?" And Sandy Hook had happened, and then soon after that, I wasn't really aware of what to do. I was in 6th grade, and then soon after that, at our school, a bunch of lockdown drills started happening throughout middle school, throughout high school, and Sophia can attest to that too.
Yeah.
Like we've gone, they'll just say it's a lockdown drill, and we'll get under the tables and we'll hide there, and we have to sit there for 15 minutes, and then they have a police officer bangs on the door in the middle of it, and I've always thought, specifically in middle school, I always thought, like, what, can we do anything about that? Like, how do we make that better? Because I don't know if that's like, it just scares us. Like, I don't understand how, what we can do about that. And then when Parkland happened, I was angry. That was my first reaction, was just anger. I was upset. And then really what happened was technology is the greatest in some cases, and then in other cases it's not. But in this case, it really was the greatest, because I was on Facebook very soon after Parkland, and I saw that they wanted to do a walkout. A senior named Jackson Bayer wanted to walk out on the 14th, and he wanted to, so we went to a couple of meetings. Sophia was there, I was there. Like many kids showed up, which was interesting, because we're in high school, and so, I mean, there's some kids who don't care about these issues, and then there's usually kids who do. And so it was just so great to see, so many kids were there, and they were interested, and they wanted to help. And I, we did the walkout. It was it was emotional to see all of our hard work to try to get this up and running. And we were admitted into the walkout at our school, and nobody was on the field. Nothing happened. And then all of a sudden, just around our school, the whole entire school just came down onto the field. It was so fascinating and interesting to see so many people want to come and support, and the people who didn't were there too, because they wanted to see what happened. And I had many debates with those students, and I wanted to, because I like to listen to the different views that people have, and then make up my own mind. And I feel like that's something that we all could do. And so, when the walkout happened, the march happened, and recently, I think it was Mary Lee who said, what's next? What's the future now? What are you gonna do now? And for a couple of days, I've been thinking, what do we do now? Because being realistic, we can't, we could keep on walking out, but we have a Congress and the administration whose views are more watered down when it comes to this issue, if have any or resistance towards this issue. And so it came to me, and what I think, and from listening, what we need to do is register to vote, and we're listening to, I'm just listening, it's so important. And there's gerrymandering, and there's all sorts of things that happen to prevent people from voting, so we need to sign up to vote. We need to in November, we need to vote, because November is really important, because that's going to decide what the Congress is going to be, what the Senate, the House, and then
But keep voting.
yeah, and also I feel I want this issue to I want somebody to do something about this issue, and I think a lot of us do, and we don't know if the administration's going to do anything. We don't think they are, but what we do know is that what we can do is vote, and what we can do is continue talking about it. And the great thing about social media and the great thing about technology is we're able to spread the word quicker, and so that's what we did, and we're going to continue doing it. So thank you.
So, Sophia, here it comes to you. I think one of the things to hearken on the book a bit, and the more to be said about the book 1968, The Year That Rocked the World, Mark Kurlansky. He notes at the beginning, in that prologue, and then the first chapter, the week that began the year is kind of significant in terms of then what goes on in the rest of the book. That's kind of encyclopedic. It's a dense book. I'm sitting before you as a facilitator. Confession's good for the soul. I didn't read it from page to page. Okay, I've done a really intense scan on it. But at that beginning, he talks about the war. He talks about the student movement as two key features, among others, but key. And so student movements then and now, are before us. And I want to turn to you in terms of, yes, that initiative and that student movement. We've heard some things from Eddie on that, echoed by you, but let's hear it from you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I was politically active, and my mom was a lawyer, but it wasn't really until Sandy Hook, similar to Eddie, that there's this sense of fear in school, and you're like, wow, this issue is really affecting everybody. And I more so, it was always in the back of my mind, but I think one thing in addition to technology, as Eddie was saying, and how that started student movements was really the age. Where in Sandy Hook, I was in 8th grade or 7th grade, we were all in middle school, and then the people directly affected by Sandy Hook, they were in elementary school. But now the Parkland students, they're in high school, and they are almost eligible to vote, and they have this voice through technology and through the media, and there's this sense of anger that's really started this movement. For me, the reason why I got involved was more so watching the videos and how like that could happen anywhere. And Parkland, they did I wrote this in my speech actually, how the Parkland or Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, they did everything right, where they had lockdown drills and they were practiced. It was relatively a really wealthy area, and yet they were still affected. So to see that was really drastic. And the students at Parkland were really the ones to step forward. And it was really crucial that this was kept a student-led movement and with the support of the adults, and that we've seen all throughout media, they're urging us to vote and vote. And one thing that I hope also in the future is to not let this particular issue die. And we've seen it fade in the media, so it's really important to keep, panel discussions like this and to keep talking. So one big distinguishing factor between student-led movements then and now, I would say, is social media and being able to connect with people from all over, and like this, like information is also on your fingertips. So we're not only able to get our voices out, but when we're not sure of something, we could search it up and we get a bunch of answers. And if we don't know how to register to vote, we can find out really easily. So the media has affected this, has changed the game, and technology and and how we can be active on here.
You helped me a whole lot with your comments just then, because in addition to, again, to the beginning of the book, Kurlansky points to, yes, the war, yes, student movement, and yes, the media. I mean, many of us can attest to the fact that you guys weren't there at the moments of 1968, and Jeff was watching TV at the beginnings there in middle school age. But the Vietnam War was the first war that, as the phrase comes, came to our living rooms. And so even as Kurlansky writes, yes, in the beginning, but elsewhere throughout the book, he cites Walter Cronkite. Do you guys know that name? And Daniel Shore. There's another correspondent. But there we go. But those guys are duly noted. Those guys, I mean, how many women back then, too? But still, the media was critically important in terms of that war coming to our living room. And then how many, I can remember vividly, March 31st in a college dorm, listening to LBJ's, very tired face was on that screen as he announced that he would not be running for re-election. And then, gosh, here came the rest of that year. It wasn't even half over. But social media, to be sure. Did you hear what Sophia just said? How many have heard a phrase like this? You can search it up. I mean, you really can. And I think some of you are doing that. Keep it up. And even, the sources for doing that are more and frequent and fluid. And so to search it up. And I pointed to the audience and said, Eddie, there's a lot of people here who can help you to register to vote. But you can search it up. You can do that in an instant. Okay. I wonder... We've really gone on in a great, I think, wonderful way with great thanks to the panel, but I'm sure we have some time for questions, comments from you all in this dear audience. I want to apologize already because we've noted a number of things, but have needed to move along. So, that might have been rapid fire and too quickly. So, again, if you have some questions and can be right to the point, we'll get at them and get some responses. Elizabeth.
I'll try to be very quick. I'm 75, I'll say from the beginning. I grew up in the segregated South, child of very much the South from hundreds of years before. But
Should she have
one-
a mic?
Yeah, that's it.
I'm sorry, but one question,
there
I'll
another
speak
mic?
louder. That's okay, I'll speak louder.
This
No.
happens in church a lot. You know, people say, oh, I can hear, but we want to make sure you're heard.
Okay, but my question for the lawyers, since I'm not a lawyer, something that's always troubled me is the words of the 14th Amendment say, nor shall any person be denied equal protection of the laws. It doesn't say any citizen, it says any person. And I know it was hotly debated at the time, you know, when it was written in 1867 or whenever it was written. And I just want to have the lawyers to help me understand why that isn't a more powerful tool, you know, because it applies to everything you've said, economic justice, civil justice, voting rights, all of that. Why it isn't more important?
I think we should go down this direction.
Yeah. Okay, you may want to write these down. There we go.
I'll call on Mr. Curran or others who are expert here in the world. I would just go back to say, there is an oath of allegiance that people take in public life. And it has always bothered me that it ends with liberty and justice for all. The reality is there isn't justice for all. From the oath, we have a promise of justice for all, but that doesn't come. What is the meaning of that phrase? Take the 14th Amendment, and half of our jurisprudence comes from those words.
It's a whole course.
And when people talk about being strict constructionists, you know, it's a contextual thing. And alas, I wish those who claim to be going back to the original words would look at the context in which they were said, such as the Second Amendment, for example. Yes, its preface is the need for a strong militia, and it's really therefore you should not deny the right of individuals to hold weapons and guns, you know, but so everything, Plessy was the law of the land, and then it changed when it didn't become. Gays and lesbians were deemed to be bad people and weren't entitled to marriage, and then that changed too. People recently, from a voting and campaign contribution point of view, corporations are now deemed people, so they can unload all of the funds they want and make sure that if you don't vote the way they wish you to vote, you'll be out of office. And as I said earlier, that's the most important thing for legislators to continue. So I can't give you a better answer than the law is a moving circumstance. It changes with those who are interpreting it and the circumstances in which we live.
I'm going to turn it to Marge, because this is kind of fascinating, particularly to me. When you say persons, that word persons is there in the 14th. You know, we're not talking citizens, are we? And I say that in a day and age, and some people in the room can attest to this, even in the moment, where, you know, folk who might not be fully documented in our midst have been apprehended. You know, what about persons? 14th Amendment. Let me stop there and turn to Marge to see if she might want to add a comment to this.
Well, as I said when I didn't have the mic, this is a whole law school course, talking about substantive due process and strict scrutiny and all kinds of questions like that. And it's, you know, it should be. That's the same kinds of questions that I have often asked. And the answer is, the law is what the courts say it is. And that's what we're stuck with.
Right.
At that moment.
Hands again. Okay, gentleman in the first row, please.
You need a mic.
Oh, the mic. There we go.
I'm going to suggest a proposal going forward to help the young people in their cause. The movements that moved in 1968, the greatest movement was amongst colleges. There was the Kent State situation. There was Berkeley. They were arresting people left and right. People were trying to get out of being drafted. They were burning their cards. And it was the college student that was the most effective in my mind. It also is the college student who does not vote. They are very complacent. They are not in their own district, and it means that they have to extend themselves a little bit to send in an absentee ballot. And only 1/4 of your people are going to be able to vote. They were the ones who will be 18. They also are the ones who are now going to college. So it's my contention that that's where you should direct your effort, to get college people to vote. Right now, they are not voting in the numbers when they should, that they should.
Okay, I think one of the questions is just, we don't have some fact checkers in the room, but I don't know the data on that. I think, it's a very good point. If there's not a question, there's certainly a challenge and a charge there. Two people to my right and left, far right, far left, that's another way to put it, have mentioned, voter registration. Stay tuned for that. I really like to think, this is a little editorial comment, that, given the hashtag never again, and the movement and the moment in Parkland going forward, that this population, this age group is going to be coming out to the polls. And
They will, but they should at the same time influence that huge number of educated people who are now not voting.
Right. I wonder, again, looking to see if there's any question. Any question? Amy, you had one, please.
I didn't have a question, but
We're looking for questions.
Turn it into a question.
all right, turn it into a question. I am really very concerned, and I would like the opinion of the lawyers on this panel. This outrageous raid by the FBI on the offices of Michael Cohen, I think is something that should concern every American. I really do feel this is something.
Okay, there's a question about you're alleging outrageous raid. Yes, just to put a point on this, there obviously was, those things don't happen without papers and some element of jurisprudence. I don't know if the lawyers want to comment on that.
I would like them to, if
Okay.
they would, please.
I'll just comment with it. I have perhaps too much confidence in our federal court system. I actually do think that overall, and with some exceptions, it is a very honorable group of people. And I'd like to think that the warrant was obtained only with appropriate permission. And I think we'll have to find out what happens. But that's way beyond the topic of this panel.
Any other questions? Please. Fran Snedeker.
I'll stand up so I can be heard better. I am delighted to hear the students talk about the importance of voting and getting registered to vote and so forth. But I think that I wondered to what extent you also incorporating that, staying educated about the issues in between opportunities and getting involved in political campaigns. Because as we really saw in the most recent state senator election, the fact that the corporations can spend money like crazy, but it was people who got the election, who turned the election to vote for mayor.
Yeah, well, your question specifying about like how we're gonna continue talking about it between, yeah, so that's a good question, and that's something that I definitely was concerned about. We see after the Las Vegas shooting, that quickly died down. I think it's because the persistence of the Parkland students. I know one of the most notorious ones, David Hogg, talking about Laura Ingraham and how he really attacked her sponsors. And so getting corporations involved and letting the criticizers or the people criticizing keep this topic in their minds helps. For me, one way is just constantly being informed about what's going on. I know for AP Gov, I just went to DC to talk with some congressmen and women. I sat in a couple committee hearings, and that was really informative and great. But again, like how I said, I hope I'm not echoing too much, the media is really pushing it. I know I still see speeches from Parkland students on Twitter, and I still see them posting about it constant. I think the April 20th walkout also happened, so it's just the matter of when midterm elections are coming along, because I know in November they're really pushing for everyone to vote in that time. But that's a concern with almost every issue, and weeks after it happens, it almost always dies down. But I have faith that this one won't, just because it is mostly affecting high schoolers, and we're constantly growing up and changing, and when we get to the age of 18, that's just however many people are eligible to vote, and it keeps building up. And I hope that it will show in the election.
Could I just say that I think that is essential, the teenage people and all others to get out there and vote, because that's the only way it's going to change, I think. And I should mention that it is not only the young people on their issues of gun violence, as to which the NRA seems to be very quiet these days, but it's also those involving women. And that's a very strong constituency. Half of the people in the country, they can make a difference if their movement keeps going, as well as a third movement, which is the Black Lives Matter. And that is not confrontational, but terribly significant and important to organize they and those folks to vote every bit as well as everyone else. So it's there are three prongs to that at the moment.
If I may, I think the numbers are really quite significant. Back in 1968, I mean, the population of the United States was 200 million. We've now exceeded 300 million. Our world population was about 3 billion. We've exceeded 7 billion. I'm not sure our voting numbers are commensurate with that. When Marge notes the registration back in Alabama, and having traveled that Route 80 from Selma to Montgomery, that is expansive, kind of more rural than not territory. To consider that back in 1968 it was a minuscule number compared to what happened in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act is rather significant. Imagine, to this gentleman's question in the front row about the student population, you guys, and it'd be great. I mean, Sophia, Eddie, come back with the data. I mean, Sophia's going to Washington. We should have another seminar, bring the lawyers too, and find out just what those numbers are for the sake of a commitment in midterm elections. Let's turn over here. One last.
I feel that the Parkland students also were so much more sophisticated than I was. I went to the March on Washington. I thought, kumbaya, the whole thing's changing. I was against the Vietnam War, but these people connected to other people. They got up and they said, we're not just speaking for the students from our school, we're also speaking for all the black youth that have been shot to death and have not been talked about. So I felt that they and young people today bring much more reaching out and much more empathy for the whole of our country than we did. We were much more narrow-minded. And I commend them for not saying this is about Parkland. This is about all youth who are killed violently. I
just wanted to say, I'll I'll go with you guys for 10 more minutes if that's okay. We'll go through some questions quickly. I mean, I think one of the notes that is, if I could on this, the element of social media, Sophia noted it, Eddie's onto it as well. The rest of the folks in the room, like myself, are catching up with that. But the rapid fire instantaneous dynamics. When we hearken back to Martin Luther King in '68 preaching about beloved community, little did he know how beloved and dynamic a social media beloved community might be in terms of the rapid fire. And so what we hear is, yes, a real intentional commitment in that effort. Surely we saw at the March in Washington with the youth and the Gonzales and the whole crew saying that this isn't about red or blue, Republican or Democrat. They didn't want to even go or sign up or side up with that. But here was something notable on that, as well as, and you bear witness to this in some great ways, the notable notations of people who they knew. I mean, someone they knew either directly or not so indirectly who had been shot, who had been a victim and experienced the dynamics of race and racism. And clearly that witness is expressed, it's dynamic, it's in real time, even instantaneous. That's quite a dynamic for us going forward. And so, yes, let's watch the voting patterns at the polls going forward, but do bear with us. Steve Otis, may I call on you? I care about you too.
Great panel, great discussion. I have a question for the panel, if whoever wants to answer. Much of the history of voting rights has been expansion of voting rights, but now in the last 20 years we have legislatures and we have court decisions that have taken away voting rights and tried to restrict and suppress voting. And any comments about the legal challenge of how we fight against that and turn that around? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I mean, the stage is set. March mentions June and a Supreme Court ruling. What else can, particularly the lawyers, say about that? Mark?
Well, there are organizations working on these issues, the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, NAACP. Lots of people are out there bringing these legal challenges. So one thing you can do, of course, is to donate to those organizations because they need to pay their staff. They get a lot of pro bono help from big firms like Alex's and mine, but that's not all. It takes having staff. The other and the most important thing, though, is it comes back to who you vote for. All of this redistricting started after the 2010 census because there were a lot of Republicans in control of state houses, and in some states it was Democrats who were redistricting. But, very partisan, hyper-partisan redistricting. In the Wisconsin case, it came out that the Republicans in the first election after they redistricted got something like 48% of the vote and 66% of the seats in the legislature because they were so effective at how they redistricted. So once again, it comes back to voting. It also comes back to things like the 2020 census. What's happening now, and the Lawyers Committee is about to file a lawsuit or has just filed a lawsuit on this, is that the government is trying to put in a citizenship question into everybody's census questionnaire, not just the selected people who get long questionnaires. And they clearly are doing this to frighten people away from admitting that they are not citizens and to prevent them from being counted in the census. And so once again, it comes back to who's running the store. And so, contribute to the legal services organizations and keep voting.
One more question, but before that, Alex.
Yeah, that is a critical issue as I find the thought of many people that the democracy as we've known it is under siege, and indeed it is. But another fact on the voting is more is being allocated and offset into the states from the federal government. It is the notion of one party, we should need less federal government and let our people in the states do it. The states, the vote there is critical. They're restricting abortion. They are doing things with Medicare and Medicaid, on their criminal justice system. So much of what is now affecting the lives of our citizens is now being put into the states, and it's critical not only in the congressional, but in the states, such as the great district here, just having elected a senator in the state government. So state voting is important too.
One last question, I'm glad to call on John Gitlitz. I mean, I don't, and before John speaks, you know, with regard to this matter of voting and, or any concerns or dare I say constraints, the Johnson Amendment, you know, with regard to the tax exemption for churches and houses of worship, and the threat or talk from the White House that could and should be repealed, so that such religious entities can line up in political ways, I think is a serious mistake. And you know, I think in terms of the efforts that Marge points to in terms of organizations and support for such organizations in terms of matters of public domain voting, I would urge that action not be taken. And so stay tuned for more on that. Glad to talk about that at another time, but it's along the lines of perhaps in response to Steve's question. Now, as promised, for our last question, Professor John Gitlitz.
And I'm going to open up a completely different topic. Not a completely different topic, but my own stick on it. One of the themes that all of you have raised, every single one of you have raised, is that the right to vote is crucial. The right to vote is political power. It's the most important civil right. We live in a county in which 25% of the population is foreign born. That may be a little bit of exaggeration by percentages. Many of them are citizens. Many of them could be citizens. But a lot of them aren't and can't be. And yet every day we are taking policies that affect them in ways that I find really objectionable. But we don't pose that as a civil rights issue. At least I don't see it in the press. We get some scream about picking people up and doing this and that. Even the most generous immigration reforms that I've seen, I think the 2007 one, when it did open up a path to regularizing status and citizenship, it was 13 years long. That is clearly a strategy to deny political power. And when we talk to the community and try to figure out what we can do for them, we think that the politicians don't have to pay attention that much because they don't have a lot of political power except framing in the streets. Is it a civil rights issue, and how can we make it? There
we go. That's the summary line. Marge, Alex, I mean,
you got 2 minutes because this is about to end.
Is it a civil rights issue? You know, is it a civil rights issue as the Constitution defines it? Maybe not. Is it a human issue that we all should care about? Certainly. And while there's room for difference of opinion about the best way to proceed, the one thing I didn't say in response to Mr. Otis's question was the other thing you can keep doing is contact your elected representatives all the time. They only respond to not they only respond, but they certainly do have to listen to what their constituents tell them. So if you care about something, let them know all the time. And may I just say one thing in conclusion? I just want to say, I want to quote a college classmate of mine who signs all of his emails with a tagline that at the end says, resist, persist, repeat. And that's my motto.
Did you know that person? You did in the 60s, didn't you?
Yes, I did, very slightly. I know him better now.
There we go, there we go.
On the immigration?
Please.
Yeah, we've reached a new stage of xenophobia. It has turned slightly from people of color, but it's become matter of religion now. Now it happens to be Muslims. We have the very far-right evangelical Christians who are against gays, gay marriage, who are against having to serve people because we don't like what their religious belief may be, or that contrary to our religious belief. I think the the issue of race, while still is a major factor of us, religion certainly is taking a major place, Bill. And I think efforts of interreligious opportunity, I know you've been engaged in that as well, are very important. That we are one nation, one people. We all came from somewhere else, except the Indians, and we've gotten rid of them. It's a one world, getting smaller every day. So the burden for you is to help us all understand that there's one basic thing with all religions, of we are our brother's keeper and our sister's keeper, and let us help reach a sense of understanding, compassion, and justice for all.
Well, I am rather touched and humbled. I mean, the people to my immediate left and right, and thanks to the others to the extremes of Brother Jeff and Eddie and Sophia. But these, what we just heard from Marge and from Alex, I would suggest to you, constitutes a benediction. Really, those last lines, I mean, I wrote it down with some help, as Marge echoed it, and whoever that college classmate and greater friend who has, as that person has become, resist, persist, and repeat. And then two, this matter of, yes, inclusivity, which is more than a politically correct term. I'm aware most certainly of a voice strong going into that year 1968 that was snuffed out and cut down, Dr. Martin Luther King, who persisted, who resisted, who repeated that continually, and that being a call to and for the beloved community, where there is, welcome, inclusivity, this respect and appreciation one to another. If I may, that travel ban, which we're going to hear more from the courts as the
It's going to be upheld.
It's going to be upheld. But even to note that, remember what its first iteration and distinction definition was? It was a Muslim ban.
Yes.
And there were countries identified because of that religion.
Yes.
I mean, all the more reason. I mean, this is really more of a seminar than something short. But, back in the day, before, when you mentioned the Christian Coalition and the exclusivity of that, as Newt Gingrich came in, that was a little beyond 1968. But those were the days when, and just before that, Reverend Jerry Falwell in 1968 decried what was happening in the streets with Dr. Martin Luther King and the voices of clergy. And even on the New York Times front page wrote an article entitled, well, there was cited, Ministers in Marching. And he blasted King and those who would, out of their religious conviction or otherwise, note that. That's another seminar, a discussion another day. But I just want to pause and punctuate with great thanks to this wonderful panel. Sophia, Eddie, Jeffrey, Marge, and Alex. I've been honored and delighted to be a part of it. And then too to say that these folks might be lingering for questions, queries that you might have. And also, there's been a special request from the high school. Your teachers have asked that Eddie and Sophia be pictured with the panel in a picture, so there'll be proof and maybe course credit. So we'll do that. Thank you all very much.